Hello, my friends. Welcome back to the program. We're going to talk about you and maybe writing a book. Our guest is Quentin Miller, who's a professor and chair of English at Suffolk University, and one of a number of wonderful professors that I speak with from the great Suffolk University. We're fortunate to have that resource here in town. Thanks for being with us, sir.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Now, a lot of folks with this pandemic have a lot of time, and many have decided this is a good time to write a book. I am sort of one of those, and I'll confess that I hope to learn some things for myself during this interview. And let me talk a little bit more about you. You teach a lot of courses. You can't possibly teach all these in one semester.
No.
Introduction to Literature, American Literature, Bob Dylan and the Beat Generation, and then an honors course in Bob Dylan and the Beat Generation. Out of curiosity, what is the difference between the regular course and the honors course?
Usually there's not that much of a difference, really. It's just a different population of students who are, maybe looking to challenge themselves with an additional text or two and writing an additional paper. So it's just kind of a turned up version of it.
All right. And is that a course on history of the Beat Generation and Bob Dylan, or is it a writing course?
So it's more of a history of the two and kind of how one leads into the other, how Dylan was influenced by the Beat Generation, but then, took things in his own directions afterwards. So it's about the poetry first and the novels and then the music. Students usually can't wait to get to the Bob Dylan part, but then they discover the Beat Generation and they get really excited about that. So.
All right, Professor Miller, let's get to this. How do you know if what you have to say warrants a book?
It's a good question. I think that the big key to writing a book is to reading a lot of books, actually. And you really can't. You've got to read if you want to write. And I think that the more, if you're just sort of inspired, but you're not really a reader, then you're probably doing yourself a disservice. You've got to understand what other people have brought to the table and how whatever it is you want to write about fits into the landscape. Is it something brand new and unique? Probably not. It's something that adds to a broader conversation. And so I think you have to enter that conversation before you can really contribute to it. First day of my fiction writing classes, I always ask students what they've read lately. And I'm surprised a lot of them kind of go back to the books that they had read in high school, meaning that they hadn't read a lot lately. And it's like, well, you want to be a writer, so we've got to do a bit of reading and understanding, where it is you're gonna enter into this. And I think it just builds confidence. Once you've read a lot of other books, then you start thinking, well, I do have something to say. Nobody has said this before, and I think that's the moment when it clicks, and you think, all right, I'm ready.
Seems like fiction would be exponentially more difficult than nonfiction, especially if the nonfiction were to be about a thing because writing about a thing all you need to do is fully and interestingly tell the story. But you don't have to create the story. In fiction, right. you gotta create this, which creates another layer and a really, really hard layer of work. And it's difficult to, for example, writing dialogue that sounds natural is extremely difficult. Correct?
Yeah, it is. And it's really at odds with the way a lot of us have been taught to write. For instance, in grammar school, middle school, high school, you're taught never to use contractions in, you have to write would not instead of wouldn't. But if you're writing dialogue, it's all contractions. That's the way people talk. I just said that. I wouldn't say that is the way people talk. So you have to kind of teach yourself to be a little bit less formal and you develop an ear for the way people talk if you want dialogue to be authentic. And I think if you're writing fiction, it's got to be. There's always dialogue in fiction. So there's a lot of listening involved, but I guess that's kind of parallel to what I was saying before about reading. You kind of have to observe a lot. But I want to go back to something else you said too. It's terrifying to a lot of people to kind of just create fiction because you think, well, I'm developing a world, something that's not real, something that's kind of only in my imagination. And that's when people kind of get writer's block. But I think that writer's block can be, and this would be another tip I would give, I guess, it's only real if you want it to be. If you're kind of worried about whatever it is you're creating, you have to kind of become courageous in order to do that, and just say, well, I'm not really making anything up. I'm observing the way the world is, and I'm recording it. And so it is, in a sense, not that different from nonfiction.
I think maybe hypersensitive to dialogue because I often say no one would say that, and a lot of times the no one would really say that is a result of people trying to explain stuff through dialogue, like explain the setting through dialogue. They overstate what is going on instead of just saying, making a sentence. They try to get some explanation of what's going on in there, and they would never say that in real life. They wouldn't need to explain that thing because it would be known to them anyway.
Yeah.
So we sort of talked about what are the best reasons to write a book and not great reasons, I suppose. One is just the ego of I want to write a book. It's probably a bad reason, right?
Yeah, because I think one of the big things to keep in mind when you're writing is the reader. You know, that you're doing this for someone else, and I think a lot of the times people think, well, it's my whatever I wrote, it's coming from my soul. You know, it's so the way I expressed it is got to be right. Well, you always kind of have to keep the reader in mind, and this is like the first rule of rhetoric. Writing is situational. It means that every time you're writing, it's for a purpose of some kind. So people write all the time, right? We write texts, we write emails, we write, responses to what people have written online. So we're constantly writing, and all those situations are a little bit different. And we adapt. I mean, it's amazing how people adapt to writing situations. We've all learned how to use emojis in our text, for instance. There's nothing natural about that, but it's something that we've learned to do. So yeah, I think that if you're writing for yourself, that's great, and it's called a diary, right? It's not something that really is out there for the world. It's kind of for you. If you're writing for someone else, this goes back to the idea of reading. That you kind of think about what the pleasures of reading are, what the expectations of reading are, what the conventions of reading are. So if you've got one type of reader in mind, that's great. If it's many types of readers, you've got to do a lot of different things. So if you can kind of imagine who the reader is, and think about communication, that's really one of the points of any kind of writing. You're communicating to someone, and what is it that you want to say to that person, and how are they going to receive it? What are their expectations? What are their what are they looking for? What are they hoping to get out of it?
Back to dialogue. As you mentioned, the bulk of today's writing is extremely abbreviated. It's texts, etc. Does that drag down the quality of writing as well? If you're going to be natural and real in the way you write dialogue, then don't you have to dumb it way down below what you're comfortable with?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think in some ways it does. It's the way we communicate has become really abbreviated, like almost little guttural, not even words sometimes, like TTYL or something. That there's that way of kind of shortening everything we do. And yet, when we talk to other people, I think conversation hasn't really changed. If you were to put a text exchange into a short story, for instance, go back and forth, it would look really different from people actually talking. So again, thinking about the situation and the way people interact or react, like if you're in a really tense situation, or if you're sitting really close to someone, or if you're in a subway or something like that and trying to have a conversation and things are loud around you, you start to speak a little bit differently. So I think that just kind of imagining whatever the situation is within a story, if we're talking about fiction, it'll change. And again, the ear of the writer has to account for that and really think about what somebody would say in this situation, not what somebody would say in all situations, because we change. We're human.
Circling back to something you mentioned earlier, in order to write, you really need to read. Is there a book, if you had to recommend one book as a template that had all the pieces necessary for a decent book, and they're clearly there? Do you have a book you would, or maybe a book you do, recommend as a template for, say, writing fiction or writing nonfiction?
That's an excellent question, and I always had trouble with the recommend a book, recommend a movie, because I just think my own memory is so bad. So I just got to go back to whatever the most recent thing I've read is. Right now, I'm reading for, I don't know, the 10th time, 20th time in my life, James Joyce's short story collection Dubliners, because I'm taking a group of students to Ireland this semester during spring break. We're reading Irish and Irish American literature, and I was just rereading hers, published in 1911. What a spectacular collection of short stories that is, and it's just kind of got everything in it, and every story is a bit different, that they don't all seem the same, and he kind of nails it. He really draws you into the world. You can picture the characters, you can hear their voices, you can see the scene, all the things we really want to do when we read a book of fiction. So at this moment right now, that's one that I would recommend.
Would you recommend a person learn the art of the short story before writing a book, or is that an unnecessary and time-consuming detour? Because that's a thing on its own. That's a joyful thing, the great short story. Is that a waste of time, or is that a good plan?
It's a good question. And, when I teach fiction writing, we really don't have, a lot of students will want to be working on a novel, but where we only have 14 weeks together or something. So it's not the same thing. I think it's harder to write a short story in a lot of ways. And other writers back me up on that. Those who have written both novels and short stories say it's actually harder to write a short story because they're so compressed, because you can't waste any time. It's the same is obviously true of poetry, that every word matters. And in a lot of ways, it's a great exercise because it gets you to pay really careful attention to language, which is what I think the goal of any writer should be. So the more compressed it is, the more kind of on your toes you have to be as a writer. There's something called flash fiction, and not too many people really read it, but a lot of people write it. Flash fiction is a short story that's either defined as being 1,000 words or less, or sometimes 750 words or less. So really short, really compact. And you're thinking, how can I tell a story in that amount of time, or with that limited amount of space? And it just kind of forces you to do things very efficiently. So I think it's a good practice. It's kind of like how a musician would have to, play scales over and over again just to kind of get the muscle memory there, so that they can go on to do more ambitious things.
Right. And some mistakes, some writing mistakes would show up there in a short story that you could submit to a wiser, more experienced person, and they could say, "Oh yeah, this, don't do that, do more of this." And so you could get that out of the way in the short story before you attempt the novel or a book.
That's right. Yeah, and you bring up a good point too. Is one that I wanted to mention at some point today. It's the role of an editor. A lot of people think of writing as this really solitary activity, right? We've got some vision of writers as people like Emily Dickinson, who kind of never left her little space and never really showed her writing to the world, or Marcel Proust, French writer, who wrote Remembrance of Things Past, who put himself into this room that was lined with cork so that he couldn't hear the outside world. So it was just, kind of him and his imagination or his mind. That's a really romantic notion of what writing is. It's not usually like that at all. It's an exchange. And I think that one of the things that you have to do, and I was talking about the reader before, the role of the reader, you have to show people your work and get feedback on it. That's what we do in writing workshops. And I think it's just super important to have a trusted group of readers, people who are going to give you honest feedback and say, like you said before, nobody talks like that, or look, you're kind of off on a tangent here. When I was writing my dissertation, I had a dissertation advisor, one of the assistant advisors, and she was famous for her purple pen, right? It was not a red pen, but it was a purple pen. And she handed me back a chapter of my dissertation at one point. And she says, I think it'd be better this way. And with her purple pen, she had put an X through 27 straight pages that I had written, 27 pages in a row. And I thought that this was like, stabbing me in the heart or something. But she was absolutely right. It was like, I was, off in the wrong direction. So writers need to develop kind of communities of people, and an editor is one of them. But, maybe your spouse is another one, maybe your friend is another one, maybe ideally another writer is somebody who can give you good feedback and say, I'll read your story if you read mine, or I'll read your chapter if you read mine. What do you think? and then talk about it. And like you say, get specific feedback. It would be better without this. It would be stronger if you did this. You're missing this. I can't picture this character. I can't see where this is taking place, or whatever it is. So that establishing a community, I think, is absolutely crucial.
Seems like a class, excuse me, taking a class would be great, because the teacher's not your friend. The teacher's there to instruct you. And I feel like it might be easier to take criticism from a teacher first. You're going to trust that feedback much more. It's less personal. Do you agree with that? And where's a good place for people to take writing courses that aren't enrolled in a full-on university?
Yeah, that's a great question. My son is doing this now. He lives in New York, and he's found a writing group that he initially, took a class. It was just kind of a continuing education class, and they all gave each other feedback. There was a teacher, kind of like a group leader, wasn't giving grades, but was giving really good feedback and kind of telling them how to get published and so forth. In Boston, there's a great organization called Grub Street. It's sort of located in the Seaport District, and they do readings there, and they have a lot of classes that they offer on weekends and nights. And they're led by, workshop leaders who are in the field, and they have readings that happen there. They've got a bookstore there. It's a wonderful place. A lot of colleges, universities in the area will have continuing education courses. That's the way to do it. So yeah, there's definitely opportunities out there for people who are not enrolled in college to find that community. And I would say it's absolutely crucial, not only for getting that feedback, but also just for kind of keeping you honest. One of the things that happens is that people will say they want to write a book, but the motivation is one thing, but then life happens, right? That there's not the time to do it. Writing is something that you kind of, and everyone figures this out at some point, you just have to dedicate the time to it. And if you're going to be presenting your work to other people, it's like having a deadline, and people need deadlines. They really do. It's just hard to manage it along with everything else that's happening in one's life.
Right. You need the specter of shame hanging over your head.
Yeah, or at least performance.
I didn't have a chance to do it.
Yeah.
Okay. Why don't you, if you could, give us some tips, tricks, do's, don'ts that we haven't touched upon now that might be helpful to a first-time writer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a couple of things. One is that you said earlier, how do I know when I'm ready to do this thing? How do I know that I have something to say, essentially? And I would say that everyone has something to say, so that there's something about kind of getting over whatever the demons are that have been haunting you. If you had some, fourth grade teacher who used to hit you with a ruler on the knuckles every time you used a comma wrong or something like that, that can really inhibit somebody. And I would say just to kind of relax, because the whole process of writing, just think about writing as a process, is crucial there. Like, give yourself permission to write a really bad book or a bad first draft or whatever it is. Not to say it's going to come out perfect every time. Initially, there's this myth that, well, if you write it, then it doesn't have to change at all. You've just got to kind of commit to the idea that it happens. It doesn't all happen at once. It happens in stages. It's a process. There's pre-writing, writing, rewriting, revising, editing, and those things happen slowly over time, but they happen. And as long as you're kind of committed to it, then it's fine. If you throw 1,000 words on the page one day and somebody comes in with a purple pen and crosses them all out, that's okay. You still have to kind of get to that point. So I think kind of giving yourself permission to write that bad first draft is fine. I'd say the second thing that's kind of related to that is kind of developing good daily habits, right? Like writing in a journal. The word journal comes from the French jour, which means day. The word diary comes from dia in Spanish, which means day, right? So the idea is to kind of write every day and really find the time to do it. Some writers, like Hemingway, used to give himself a word count every day. He wouldn't stop writing until he got into a certain number of words. Other writers develop rituals. Jonathan Franzen, apparently, every time he sits down to write, he smokes precisely 7 cigarettes. I've heard this anyway, during the writing time, so that that's the amount of time he's going to need to get to whatever he can. So actually, you know, I'm not telling people to go out and smoke if they want to be a writer or something, but to find their to find their habits, to develop those habits so that you are committing to it, you're putting time in, and also again allowing yourself to fail so that you can succeed. That's you know, it's kind of crucial. Another thing I'd say is that passion and energy have to really be behind every type of writing, no matter what it is. I said there's many different types of writing, you know, it's situational or whatever. But if there's no passion and energy, if you don't really feel like, you know, you're really behind something, it'll come through. It'll be obvious. So that you have to infuse the writing with, and I'm not saying it has to be about an exciting subject, something that's exciting for everyone, but you have to be kind of excited about it in order for the writing to kind of pop and move along. And then finally, I guess I would say, yeah, this close attention to language, to really thinking about exactly what the right word is going to be when you're revising, when you kind of go back to it. Say, am I expressing that right? Is there a better word to say the same thing? Does this sentence need to go on as long as it is? Would it have a better effect if I rethought it and chopped it up? Just because you've written something, it doesn't mean that you have to keep it. We call this killing your darlings in writing. You have to, you know, if you wrote something that you're really attached to, you have to also be willing to get rid of it, to say maybe it's stronger without that. I see a comment coming up, passion is needed to do anything. Yeah, absolutely. You just really got to put your, you know, your heart and soul into it if you want it to be valuable.
All right. Cliches are a buzzkill for me. And can you give us some sort of guide to cliche avoiding?
Yeah. Oh boy. Yeah. I mean, you know, what I've done with my students is to have them identify cliches when they see them, and then talk about why cliches are such a buzzkill. It's because it feels unoriginal, right? That if you're, you know, saying something that other people have said before, and it's just very obvious. There's kind of like word packages too. I'll show to students. Like if I were to say hustle and what's the next word? Everybody would say bustle, right? Everybody, we just know that those words kind of go together. When you find a word package like that, something that everybody says all the time, it starts to seem like a cliche. So there's got to be an original way to express it. The only time a cliche would really work, I think, in fiction, if you're writing fiction, is if you were writing about a character who thought about the world in terms of cliches, and you were kind of, you know, examining that character. And that would show that, you know, you can still have a cliche in your writing, but it's there for a purpose. It's there to kind of call our attention to the fact that this character doesn't think very originally or something.
Right.
Yeah. So those cliches, that's a way to get back to you know, a precise way of thinking about something. What's another way to express that cliche? Right. What's a way that might, you know, push it in another direction that doesn't make it a cliche?
And folks, if you're worried about not recognizing cliches and not really knowing what we mean, if it's a phrase or a word package that people, if you've heard people use it a bunch, don't use it. Mm-hmm. Is that a good way to put it? Or change it. Instead of hustle and bustle, it's kind of cool to say hustle and some other cool word.
Yeah.
There's an online thesaurus. Look up another word for bustle, and that would turn a cliche into something cool, which is almost cooler than not using it at all. Sometimes. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, there can actually be, you know, a way to kind of explode open that cliche. I remember one of my very first things I was writing for a fiction workshop. I had a character who was up on the top of the Eiffel Tower, and he was looking down at the people below, and he said they look like ants, which is what everybody says, right? And then he caught himself. He said, actually, no, they don't look like ants at all. And he started, you know, kind of working against his own way of thinking and trying to, I forget what he came up with, but it was, you know, he actually corrected himself within it. And that was, you know, another thing to do with a cliche is just to kind of get rid of it, to put it out in the open and then say, no, that's not actually the way people look.
All right. And folks, if you ever involved in some news event and the media interviews you, please also be aware of the cliche. For example, if you are caught in a tornado and you're interviewed, please do not say, it sounded like a freight train coming at me. think of, like, if you're going to get interviewed, think ahead, think of another word for freight train or something. Do me a favor. And as far as overused words, like like is one of them. Sorry,
Mhm.
although in this case it might be appropriate. But words like amazing, please never say that word. Never write it ever again. That one has to go. Are there any other words that you're hearing? The list of most overused words, or the words to get rid of, a list just came out. What are a few words you would put on that list that, at least for this time, this period, please don't use? Do you have any?
I think everyone's got their pet peeves. Mine is the word impactful. I hate that word. Impactful for me, just it was a word that was it came out of nowhere, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago. And I think it should go back to nowhere. It's not a word that means anything. Again, if you're thinking about precise language, to say something is impactful, it just doesn't do it for me. But I think those words change for everybody. And one thing that I've noticed with writing, is that if somebody uses a word once, they'll sometimes use it again without realizing it. Even if it's a perfectly fine word, they'll do it in close proximity. Like in the next paragraph, the word perfectly would show up after you just use the word perfectly. I almost think it's just something our brains do sometimes. Like you use the word, that worked, and then you use it again. And I think that during the revision process, again, first draft, feel free to throw all the amazings and impactfuls and freight trains and everything else that that you want. But then when you go back and look at it again with fresh eyes, that's what revising means, right? To see again. Then you start seeing that, or somebody else points it out to you, like, look, you just used that word 3 times in one paragraph. What's a better word? What's a different way to say that, so that it pops a little bit better, that it moves ahead a little bit more too.
All right, I try to keep this to about half an hour. I did go over yesterday, and I vowed I wouldn't today. So let me wrap this up with a question about the writing business, the music business, and the radio business. They've all changed, I guess, largely due to the internet. And I'm wondering how the writing business has changed recently.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. It's something I hope to mention too. That writing, if you're doing it, I said before, it's a form of communication. It is that. We also regard it as an art form, so it's both communication and art. But then the third part of it, and there's many more parts too, is that it is a commodity. It is something that you're hoping to sell, right? That there is a publishing industry. And for a lot of people, the motivation might not be to become wealthy doing this, but just to kind of get your name out there, to find readers somehow. So I think that, the more familiar you become with the market, again, how are other people getting their names out there? How are they getting read? You have to be aware of that as you're doing it. What's a good way to do this? So people, for instance, will blog, and that's a form of writing. That might be a way of developing, getting a publisher's interest eventually. So there's many different ways to do it. There's a lot of websites out there that will tell you how to do it. And there's a big difference between self-publishing and publishing for a traditional publishing house. I think that the big difference is that editorial process. There's an editor there who's going to tell you things. They may not be things you want to hear, but they are things that presumably will make a book more marketable. But you have to kind of do some research and not just think that since you've created something, everyone in the world is going to want to hear it or hang it on their wall or read it. To kind of use the parallels between those industries, you have to think about what the best ways are to get it out there, and to observe the way other people are doing it. Like, wow, that's a really successful blog. How are they doing that? How are they managing to kind of connect to others, which I think is ultimately the goal.
One thing that's valuable to do is, and we may have brushed up against it, but really think about your motivation. What motivates you? I think that the classic way to think of a book is, I'm going to write a book and it's going to sell to millions of people. That's going to make me feel good. But it turns out for me, and I bet for a lot of people, that the millions of people that are beyond the people I know don't really matter to me. Just a number. What really motivates me, and I bet it's really what maybe subconsciously motivates others, is peer approval. If the people I know and respect see my work and respond, attaboy, that's a good
Yeah.
job. Then that's like really what feeds me. And the unseen millions don't really provide that much gratification. Just,
Yeah.
of course, some some abstract ego massage, but other than that, it's the peer appreciation, and therefore you don't need to sell millions of books, and therefore you don't really need a publisher, right? And which brings me, I guess, to the final question: if what drives you, like me, is peer approval, then self-publishing is really an option. Yeah, it might cost you some money, but not, not that much. And you will have written a book that your peers see. There it is. You did it.
Yeah.
What about self-publishing? Is it more and more doable?
Absolutely, yeah. It's and there are some companies that can make your book look really nice, and you can hand them out to friends, and
Right.
this is and then if your friends are reading it, and I think that that's the key. The worst feeling is if you write something, whether or not you've published it, and you ask someone to read it, and they're like, yeah, I'll get around to that, and they don't. Then maybe you need to find a new community of people who will. If there are other communities out there, and if your friends aren't really readers and you've written it for their approval, then you're kind of, you feel a little bit of a missed opportunity there. But it just means that they're not your readers, and maybe there are others. And
do you find that there's as much internal reward for publishing something online, because that's where most people are going to read it, or a lot of people are going to read it, and where you can easily receive your positive feedback that feeds you and rewards you is public. Maybe you don't even need to self-publish. What if you just write stuff online and share it with your friends? Is that a valid thing?
Absolutely. And I mean, again, it depends on what your motivation is, but this is what people do on Facebook. Like, it's instant publication, right? And there's responses right away. There's likes, there's comments, there's the stuff you probably never hear. If you've published a traditional book and somebody in Peoria reads it and they love it, but you never get that feedback. So I guess it depends on how much you need that. Yeah, if you're just to put it online and see what people think immediately, that could be very gratifying for certain writers. Other writers are like, I don't even want that. If somebody didn't like my work, I don't want to hear it. I would rather they just keep that to themselves. So you kind of have to consider that, I guess.
It's difficult, the feedback. So you can get negative feedback from some just mean, vindictive person that's not at all legitimate. So you do have to grow a thick skin, and I guess you can't believe all the negative feedback you see. It's probably tough to ferret out the legitimate feedback from just mean people.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there's a website called Goodreads. I'm sure you've maybe heard of it, maybe not, but it's kind of a social media site, and I was on it way back in the day just as a way of keeping track of the books I read. And then I started exploring it a little bit, and I saw that, like with every internet, when people can comment, every Web 2.0 kind of situation, there is a lot of negativity, and it can become really distasteful and combative. And if you don't want to enter into that, you should just be aware of that. Yeah, you are going to get negative feedback, and you do have to have a thick skin. And this is also, by the way, when you're submitting things for publication, you've got to have that for traditional publication, and you got to have that thick skin. You got to expect to get rejected 50 times before you get accepted once. And if that's something you can't handle, then you're going to have to go to a different venue, because it's just the reality of the business.
Quentin Miller, a distinct pleasure. Once again, I just can't go wrong with Suffolk University. I walk by Suffolk University 4 or 5 times a week, and I look over there and I think, wow, what a great place. But it's even better than I understood now that I get to speak with the folks who teach there, like yourself. We're lucky to have Suffolk University, and I appreciate the university, and I appreciate your time, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Before you go away, we talked about doing a segment like this on the Bob Dylan and the Beat Generation. After we go off the air, so to speak, let's book that time. Can we do that?
Sure.
All right. Folks, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. If you like this, and if you want to get more involved with what I do, these things are on Spotify, if that's more comfortable for you. If you want to listen in the car, they're on pretty much, this will be pretty much on every platform So check out those other platforms. Quentin Miller, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll be clear in about 5 and 4